This video was possible with the help of the Wolf of YouTube. Enjoy!
In the spring of 1945, the last major battle of the European war was fought between the Soviet Union and Hitler's Third Reich. The Battle of Berlin, one of the most bitterly contested offensives of the Second World War, saw a gigantic Russian army of 2.5 million men unleashed in a massive assault designed to crush Nazi Germany once and for all. For the Soviet Union, Berlin was the ultimate prize. The city was the heart of the Reich. Its capture would bring immeasurable prestige to the conqueror. Just as important to the Russians, if the Red Army could take Berlin before the Western Allies, much of Central as well as Eastern Europe could be brought under communist control. For Adolf Hitler and his most fanatical followers, the last hope of salvation was that the Red Army would be defeated at the gates of the capital. In reality, the Nazis' last defiant gesture served only to trigger the most horrific battle ever fought in a city. In the flaming ruins of Berlin, hundreds of thousands of Russian and German lives were lost, and the seal was set on a victory that would divide the continent of Europe for decades to come. The beginning of the end for Hitler's Reich had come at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. There, a massive German armored offensive, culminating in the greatest tank battle of the war, was utterly broken by the Red Army. At Kursk, any prospect that Germany could again take the initiative in the east vanished for good. The Soviet offensives of early 1944 had, in the north, driven the Germans back to the borders of Estonia. To the south, the Red Army had struck in the Ukraine and had destroyed the entire southern wing of the German armies. The next stage was to finish clearing the enemy from the rest of Soviet territory. The main thrust of the Russian summer offensive, codenamed Bagration, was against the German Army Group center. The first blows fell on June the 22nd, and within 2 weeks, 3 Russian fronts had ripped through German lines, destroying 28 divisions and retaking Minsk. On July the 13th, 1st Ukrainian and 1st Belarusian fronts were thrown at Army Group North Ukraine. 2 weeks later, the Red Army reached the river Vistula. And on August the 1st, the Polish capital, Warsaw, exploded in an uprising. To the north, the front line was pushed almost as far as Riga. In 5 weeks, Germany had lost 350,000 men, a disaster greater than Stalingrad. With the Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944, the situation most dreaded by the German High Command had become a reality. The Reich was doomed to a defensive war on 2 major fronts. Within 8 weeks, the Allies had broken out of their bridgeheads. The Wehrmacht bitterly contested every inch of ground, but the enemy dominated the skies. Another 8 weeks, and Paris had been liberated. In this second Battle of France, the German army had lost 750,000 men and vast quantities of equipment. On the Allied side, it seemed to many as if the end of the war could be in sight. By mid-September, American forward units had even set foot on German soil. In spite of the shattering blows it had suffered, the German Wehrmacht remained a force to be reckoned with. As the Allies had advanced, their lines of communication had lengthened, while those of the Germans had become shorter. As yet, the Allies had the use of only one major seaport and were at the limits of their fuel and ammunition. Along the front, German resistance began to stiffen. And while the British and Americans argued over strategy, the Wehrmacht regrouped for a last-ditch offensive. The object was to split the Allied armies in two by attacking through southern Belgium and the forest of the Ardennes. By late December 1944, the front line in the west followed the course of the Ruhr, Our, and Saar rivers. In southern Belgium, there was a shallow salient, a bulge in the line, facing the Ardennes, a hilly and in places heavily wooded region. It was through this area that Hitler had launched his most deadly thrust into France in 1940. For the offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans had mustered the 6th SS and 5th Panzer armies and the 7th Army. Facing them were elements of the American 1st and 9th Armies, flanked by the 3rd. On the 16th of December, the Germans attacked. In the north, 6th Panzer Army's progress was slow, but a spearhead broke through and charged headlong for the Meuse. 5th Panzer shattered the first inexperienced American divisions it encountered, and by the 18th was fast approaching Bastogne, a vital road and rail junction. Although poor weather had, as the Germans expected, grounded Allied air forces, the offensive was already behind schedule. Wintry conditions and blown bridges were slowing the advance, and all German units were suffering from a desperate shortage of fuel. 5th Panzer had quickly surrounded Bastogne, but the Americans in the town refused to surrender, and by now, the Allies were recovering from the shock of the onslaught. By December the 24th, 1st and 9th Armies, backed by the British 30th Corps, had rallied and blocked any further German advance towards the Meuse. The US 3rd Army now turned 90 degrees and attacked the German flank from the south. On December the 26th, Bastogne was relieved, and with the weather clearing, the Allies unleashed their overwhelming air power. Within 3 weeks of the relief of Bastogne, the Germans had been forced back to their start positions. Hitler had refused to sanction a timely withdrawal, and the delay had cost the Wehrmacht most of their losses, in all 100,000 men and 600 precious tanks. For the German armed forces, the Battle of the Bulge had been a catastrophe. For months, the Western Front had been allocated the bulk of German production of tanks and heavy weapons. Vast numbers had now been expended to no avail. Meanwhile, in the east, the Wehrmacht had been starved of resources. This at a time when the Red Army was stronger and more ably led than at any period in its history. At the beginning of September 1944, 5 German army groups in the east had faced 11 fronts of the Red Army, along a line more than 1,200 miles long. By mid-October, a Soviet drive to clear the Baltic states had left most of Army Group North cut off in the Courland Peninsula, where 20 infantry and 2 armored divisions would remain trapped until the end of the war. To the south, 2nd, 3rd and 4th Ukrainian fronts had pushed into Romania and Hungary, and by late December had captured Belgrade and encircled the Hungarian capital Budapest. There, another 188,000 Axis troops were cut off. By the close of 1944, the Red Army had expelled the Germans from Soviet territory and had broken the back of the Wehrmacht. One by one, Germany's Axis allies had fallen by the wayside, and although fighting still raged around Budapest, all along the central and northern sectors of the front, Soviet forces had already begun a careful redeployment for the next major offensive. Planned for January 1945, this would be the final, all-out assault that would take the Red Army into the very heart of Hitler's Reich. To Joseph Stalin, Berlin was the prize desired above all others. As the last refuge of Hitler, the capture of the Reich's capital would be the greatest possible symbol of victory. Stalin profoundly distrusted the Western Allies and was certain they would make a dash for Berlin at the first opportunity, in spite of their assurances. To mislead the Americans, he even claimed that Berlin had lost its significance and that the main target of the last Soviet offensive would be the city of Dresden. In fact, Stalin considered the capture of Berlin so important, he bypassed not just the Stavka, his political military council, but also the Army General Staff. Eventually, in the final stages, he himself would take command of military operations. Unlike Hitler, Stalin was usually prepared to accept the advice of his generals. He had a highly flexible and retentive mind, well suited to military affairs, and often took over briefings from commanders not showing sufficient mastery of their material. At Allied summits throughout the war, the Soviet dictator deeply impressed British and American leaders with his thorough understanding of logistics. Even with his most senior commanders, Stalin was supremely devious and manipulative. While he ordered his generals to cooperate with each other, he also contrived to spur them on by encouraging deep and bitter rivalries. At Stalin's instigation, the final drive on Berlin would be turned into a race in which commander would be pitted against commander. That the result would be a reckless expenditure of Russian lives was, to Stalin, a matter of supreme indifference. On July the 20th, 1944, a bomb had been planted in the conference room of Adolf Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. The blast had killed 4 men, but by an amazing turn of luck, Hitler had escaped with minor injuries to his legs and arms. Within hours, the first of thousands of arrests had been made. Even before the attempt on his life, Hitler's relationship with his generals had been stormy, but now he became utterly paranoid. Dependent on cocktails of drugs prescribed by his personal physician, Hitler grew increasingly disturbed, unstable, and prone to violent fits of temper. The gulf between the Führer and his generals was now so great that all meaningful communication had virtually ceased. Hitler took personal control of even the minutest aspect of military operations, and his constant refrain was no withdrawal. The General Staff, desperate to gain room for operational maneuver, still the great strength of the German army, was viewed by Hitler as a collection of weak-willed and cowardly incompetents who refused to stand and fight. Hitler's response to any show of initiative in the field was to sack the offender unceremoniously. In the last 6 months of 1944, the entire army leadership on the Eastern Front had been replaced for one failing or another. The result was a complete collapse of confidence amongst senior German commanders. Many resigned, exasperated beyond endurance. The rest could do little more than stand humiliated on the sidelines, while the German armed forces and Germany itself was led to the brink of catastrophe. In November 1944, the Soviet General Staff had outlined its plan for the greatest campaign in military history. The offensive would span the entire length of the Eastern Front, and fighting would take place in 8 different countries. In spite of the gigantic scale of the planned offensive, the Red Army estimated it would take just 45 days to achieve its objective, the capture of Berlin, the city that Stalin had called the lair of the fascist beast. Unusually, Stalin did not invite his front commanders to a conference where operations and tactics would be discussed. Instead, each was summoned in turn and given his operational area and his objectives. There were to be no arguments and no compromises. Of the 9 Soviet fronts which would take part in the Great Offensive, the 2 mightiest, first Belarusian and first Ukrainian, were chosen to spearhead the drive to Berlin. Standing opposite, blocking the path to the German capital, were Army Groups A and Center. To prevent them being reinforced, supporting attacks would be launched on both flanks. To the north, 2nd and 3rd Belarusian fronts would drive towards the East Prussian cities of Königsberg and Marienburg. In the south, 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts would clear Hungary and strike into Austria. In the main thrust, 1st Belarusian would drive along a narrow front towards the Polish city of Poznan. At the same time, 1st Ukrainian would strike towards Breslau. Secondary waves of tank armies would then pour through the gaps in German lines and widen the breaches. When the Germans had been pushed to the line of the River Oder, Berlin would be at the mercy of the Red Army. 2 great flanking movements, and Hitler's capital would be doomed. The Soviet offensive was timetabled for the 20th of January 1945. This would give enough time for winter to freeze the notoriously wet Polish roads, and by then, fog would be less of a problem for the Air Force. Meanwhile, the great build-up would commence. Red Army reserves were increased all along the front, and supplies and equipment stockpiled for the operations to come. In preparation, a great propaganda offensive was begun. The Red Army was to be primed for its sweep into Germany by instilling in its ranks the deepest hatred of the German Wehrmacht and people. The keynote was revenge. The sufferings of the Soviet Union at the hands of the Germans were to be repaid in full. With the Red Army only 300 miles from Berlin, a distance the Russians were capable of advancing in as little as 5 weeks, it was obvious to the German High Command that the plight of the capital was desperate. German intelligence calculated that the Soviet attack would begin around January the 12th, and that the enemy enjoyed an advantage of 11-1 in infantry, 7-1 in tanks, and 20-1 in guns. Hitler dismissed these estimates as rubbish. No reinforcements would be sent east from the Western Front, nor would German forces trapped in the Courland Peninsula be evacuated by sea to shore up the defenses in the central sector. In Hitler's words, the Eastern Front must take care of itself. The result was an absolute dependence on fixed defensive lines, and for months, tens of thousands of civilians had been toiling to transform the Reich into one vast fortress. The Reich's system of defenses was based on 7 lines, the longest running for almost 400 miles. Each line bristled with anti-tank ditches, gun positions, and village forts, and the defensive zone was almost 300 miles in depth. Scattered throughout were heavily fortified towns or festungs. Of these, the most formidable were Königsberg, Insterburg, Poznan, Stettin, Kustrin, and Breslau. The second layer of the German defense was behind the River Oder in 3 belts 12 to 25 miles deep. If the Soviet enemy should cross the river and break through to threaten the German capital, they were to be stopped and crushed at the gates of Berlin itself. On its perimeter, the city was guarded by its own fortified defense line. Inside were yet more lines, dividing the capital into independent self-defending sectors, many crisscrossed by waterways. Berlin's massive concrete flak towers were also formidable. Their guns could be trained to fire down into the streets. The will to fight was, the Nazi leadership believed, the key to survival for the shattered remnants of the Third Reich. The population, military and civilian, must be made to believe that in defeat they would be given no quarter. For most, there was little difficulty imagining the fate that would befall them at the hands of vengeful Russians. But the West, too, had added fuel to the fire of German resolve. Almost ceaseless bombing of the Reich cities had already left many in ruins, and in the summer of 1944, an Allied plan had been discussed which seemed to promise no mercy for the German people. Germany was to be divided permanently. Huge swathes of territory were to be given to the Soviet Union, Poland, France, and Denmark. All her surviving heavy industry was to be dismantled, and Germany was to be returned to a medieval state of small farmers and a subsistence economy. The plan was supported by Roosevelt, but strongly opposed by Churchill, and was soon dropped. However, for Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, it was priceless material. To the citizens of the Reich, and especially to the inhabitants of its capital, who had suffered so much from Allied bombing, it was yet more proof that the only hope was determined resistance to the very end. By 1944, Marshal Georgy Zhukov had already proved himself the greatest and most aggressive commander in the Red Army. Zhukov was Stalin's favorite general and a popular military hero. He was brilliant, ruthless, and had never once been defeated in battle. Zhukov had successfully defended Leningrad, and at the Battle of Stalingrad had encircled and captured the entire German Sixth Army. Zhukov had also played an important part in the great Soviet victory at the Battle of Kursk. Since August 1942, Zhukov had been Deputy Supreme Commander of all Soviet forces, second only to Stalin. He had directed the huge Russian drive across the Ukraine, and as commander of the First Ukrainian Front, had advanced at an astonishing 30 miles a day in early 1944. In June, he took overall command of the Red Army fronts and orchestrated Russia's greatest military achievement of the war so far, the Bagration Offensive and the rout of the German Army Group Center. Zhukov's very success now threatened to make him an object of suspicion to Stalin, a situation usually attended with fatal consequences. However, as the finest commander in the history of the Red Army, even the Soviet dictator could not afford to move against him, and in November 1944, Stalin let it be understood that Zhukov's forces should be the ones to attack and capture the Nazi capital. Only on the eve of the attack would Zhukov learn that with Stalin, nothing was certain. Although Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner was an able soldier, he was also one of the most fervent Nazis ever to command a German army. Schörner would follow Hitler's most unrealistic orders to the letter, often with disastrous results. Schörner had been made chief of the National Socialist Leadership Corps in early 1944, and in June was in command of Army Group North during the Soviet summer offensive. With his army, Schörner was trapped on the Courland Peninsula, helpless for 6 months, until in January 1945, he was evacuated to command Army Group Center. During the final Russian attack, far from reflecting the truth of the desperate predicament in which his forces found themselves, Schörner constantly fed Hitler's delusions with promises of victory. On the eve of the last battle, Schörner would be rewarded for his slavishness. Hitler would make him a field marshal and the last commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht. During 1944, the Red Army had launched no fewer than 10 major offensives, and as the year had gone on, its performance in the field had improved beyond all recognition. The Russian ability to conduct massive battles of encirclement at speed now equaled or even surpassed the expertise of the German army at the height of its powers early in the war. The Red Air Force had also evolved into a supremely proficient service, excelling particularly in tactical operations. Its effectiveness had been radically improved by decentralizing its command structure, so that Soviet air power could respond quickly and flexibly to requests for support from the ground forces. By now, all arms of the Soviet military machine were lavishly equipped with advanced weapons. Russian industrial production, free from the disruptive effects of enemy bombing and able to call on vast reserves of labor and strategic materials, could easily replace the Red Army's losses. At the start of 1945, the strength of Soviet forces in the field was over 6 million men, 15,000 combat aircraft, 100,000 artillery pieces, and 12,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. In 1943, the T-34, once the finest tank on the battlefield, began to lose its edge against greatly improved German tank designs. In particular, the T-34's 76mm gun was no longer effective against the heavy armor of the latest Panzers. The answer was to upgun the T-34 to an 85mm weapon. The new gun demanded a new turret, and the resulting design was an efficient 3-man unit. Crew capacity went up from 4 to 5, meaning that the tank commander could concentrate on tactics and leave the gunnery to a specialist. Additional improvements included a new 5-speed gearbox and increased armor thickness to 110mm on the front and 90mm on the turret. The new tank was a formidable weapon. Together with its parent, the T-34-76, the 85 would play a central role in the coming Soviet offensive. Introduced in February 1944, the Stalin II had been designed to counter the formidable German Panthers and Tigers. Although by German standards a medium tank, the Stalin was very heavily armored and mounted an enormous 122mm gun. In its ability to penetrate armor at medium ranges, the Stalin's gun was in fact little better than the German 75 or 88, and the tank could carry far less ammunition, only 28 rounds. However, when firing high explosive shells against soft targets, the Stalin was extremely effective. In the Berlin street fighting, the Stalin would prove itself all but indestructible. The Ilyushin II Stormovik ground attack aircraft was first introduced in mid-1941 and would go on in single and two-seat versions to become the most numerous aircraft in the Red Air Force and in the history of aviation. Believed by Joseph Stalin to be the single most important weapon possessed by the Soviet Union, the Stormovik came to symbolize the resurgence of Russian power after the setbacks of 1941. The Sturmovik's capabilities in the ground attack role were due above all to its heavy armor protection. It had a continuous backbone of 7mm armor plate that protected the cockpit, radiators, engine and fuel tanks. The Sturmovik could survive anti-aircraft barrages lethal to any other warplane. The Sturmovik's engine delivered its maximum power at low altitudes. Armed with rockets, bombs, cannon and machine guns, the Sturmovik would play a leading part in the destruction of German armor and lines of communication throughout the final offensive. The Katyusha, or Little Kate, multiple rocket launcher, had been developed in the late 1930s and was first used in action in July 1941. Because of the peculiar sound it made on launching, the weapon was named Stalin's organ by German troops. By 1945, the Katyusha fired 132mm fin-stabilized rockets with 40-pound high-explosive warheads to a distance of 9,250 yards. The weapons could be mounted on 2.5-ton trucks, which had their cabs protected by steel blast deflectors, or in freestanding launchers, able to fire up to 48 rockets in a volley. To the German infantrymen, the Katyusha was the most feared weapon in the Soviet arsenal, and although the rockets were none too accurate, a Katyusha barrage could lay waste a vast area of the battlefield, destroying everything in its path. Since the Battle of Stalingrad, the Red Army had changed out of all recognition. Stalin had moved to curb the power of the detested political commissars, and a new generation of competent and dedicated officers and NCOs had risen on their merits to displace party loyalists. As for the private soldier, even the German enemy had been forced to recognize that the men of the Red Army were not only courageous in battle, but also well-trained and extremely tough. Many infantrymen had walked the 1,000 miles from Stalingrad to the Vistula, while home leave was practically unheard of. For the Red Army soldier, discipline was harsh and unrelenting. Stalin had said that it took a brave man to be a coward in the Red Army, and tens of thousands had been shot for desertion at Stalingrad alone. It was equally perilous to be incompetent or just plain unlucky, and rank offered no protection. During the course of the war, 238 generals and admirals would be shot or would die in penal battalions for failing to deliver the expected results. For commanders living with such a threat, the lives of ordinary soldiers were of little account, and there was an indifference to casualties that shocked even the Wehrmacht. The Red Army's offensive tactics reflected the value it placed on the lives of infantrymen. Major attacks were often launched not with elite guards armies, but by shock armies of infantry who would be thrown at the defences in vast numbers to create gaps which the elite units would then exploit. Often, the shock armies were themselves spearheaded by penal battalions, units made up of men who had committed military or civil crimes. Their missions were usually suicidal and could involve clearing minefields by marching across them in formation at gunpoint. By the end of 1944, the German army was a shadow of the awesome machine that 5 years earlier had unleashed blitzkrieg on an unsuspecting world. In the east, it could still field more than 3 million men, but appalling losses had severely reduced the quality of its fighting formations. At Hitler's insistence, under-strength divisions that should have been merged were retained as independent entities, carrying a heavy burden of administration and logistical support. German industry, in spite of increasing its output of war material to the highest level ever, was failing to keep up with the enemy's production, or with German losses, particularly in tanks and aircraft. A panzer division now had a theoretical strength of only 120 tanks, little more than a third of its 1939 complement. In reality, many had less than 60, and the German army was increasingly relying on cheaper, less effective, self-propelled guns. In the air, the Luftwaffe, exhausted from its desperate attempts to stem the tide of Allied air power, had already passed the point of no return. Aircraft production had reached the amazing figure of 40,000 in 1944, but even such a feat could not redress the balance. The Luftwaffe could still field fewer combat aircraft than it could in 1940. And to compound its difficulties, there was also a major fuel crisis. Allied bombers had systematically hammered the German oil industry, and in the coming months, fuel would become the constant preoccupation of every German commander of air or ground forces. By late 1944, the Mark V Panther made up around half the strength of German armored divisions on the Eastern Front. The best medium tank deployed by any army in World War II, the Panther G incorporated many modifications suggested by tank crews in the field. In particular, the Panther's side armor had been increased in thickness, and the reliability of the tank's drivetrain had been greatly improved. Like earlier models, the Panther G was armed with a supremely well-designed, long-barreled 75mm gun, capable of penetrating 120mm of sloped armor at over 1,000 yards. The Panther could carry a massive ammunition load of 81 rounds. In January 1943, a new Tiger was ordered which would have a turret large enough to mount a longer, more powerful 88mm gun than its predecessor. The King Tiger's hull design was similar to the Panther, well sloped for greater protection, while frontal armor was increased to an unprecedented 150 millimeters. The King Tiger weighed 70 tons and was the heaviest tank to serve in World War II. Delivered to frontline units in June 1944, the new tanks quickly showed they could easily destroy any opponent. In all, 489 King Tigers were built. The Nebelwerfer, or smoke thrower, as it was called for security reasons, had been developed by German scientists long before the war. Although rocket detachments were in service with the German army from 1934, the weapons did not see action until the invasion of the Soviet Union. There, the Nebelwerfer quickly showed itself to be an effective area bombardment weapon with a powerful demoralizing effect on enemy troops. The Nebelwerfer launcher was a simple design of 5 or 6 tubes mounted on a light trailer. The rockets were fired by electrical impulses, and a whole battery could be launched simultaneously. The first launchers fired 15-centimeter projectiles, but later, a more destructive 21-centimeter version was produced in significant numbers. The Goliath was an expendable remote-controlled demolition weapon designed to attack bunkers, buildings, or even tanks with a high explosive charge. The first production model was battery-powered. Later versions were powered by a motorcycle engine and carried a heavier charge over a greater distance. The Goliath was connected to its operator by a 650-meter-long 3-strand wire rolled on a drum at the back of the chassis. 2 strands controlled track speed and steered the vehicle, while the other detonated the charge. In combat, the Goliath was maneuvered up to the side of the obstacle to be destroyed and triggered from a safe distance. Although the Goliath was used extensively on the Eastern Front and was moderately successful, particularly in built-up areas, it was extremely vulnerable to small arms fire. The Panzerfaust was a single-shot, throwaway anti-tank weapon. First produced in the summer of 1943, the device was a 120-millimeter hollow-charge stick bomb fitted into a tube which contained the propellant. The Panzerfaust had a crude sight and trigger arrangement, but at distances of up to 150 meters, it could penetrate the side or rear armor of any existing tank and most frontal armor under the right conditions. Because of its cheapness, ease of use and light weight, anyone could be trained to use the Panzerfaust. In the Battle of Berlin, Home Guard and Hitler Youth would use the weapon to take a heavy toll of Soviet tanks. Germany's second infantry anti-tank rocket was the Panzer Schreck, introduced in August 1944. A copy of the American bazooka, the weapon fired an 88-millimeter shaped charge projectile. The launching tube was reusable, and because of its shape, the weapon was known to German troops as the stovepipe. By the last months of the war, large numbers of Panzer Schrecks and Panzerfausts had been issued to tank destroyer battalions and Panzer Grenadiers. For the first time, the infantryman had become an extremely dangerous opponent for tanks, particularly in wooded or built-up areas where cover was good. Because both weapons produced quantities of flame and smoke, the position of the user was betrayed at once, and it was vital to change location immediately after firing. The MG-42, one of the most successful machine guns ever built, had been designed in 1937. The new technology of metal stamping was then still in its infancy and had never been used to make anything quite so intricate. The idea of stamping, pressing and welding horrified traditional gun makers, accustomed to producing weapons to the highest quality. But the finished machine gun successfully passed its last field trials in the autumn of 1941. Although crudely manufactured, the MG-42 was extremely sturdy, had a very simple barrel-changing system and an exceptionally high rate of fire. In 1942, it was approved for mass production, each unit costing a quarter less than its predecessor, the MG-34. When an example was first captured by the Allies, its performance amazed ordnance experts. The MG-42 was a popular weapon with the troops of the Wehrmacht, but it did have some weaknesses. Its high rate of fire made it wasteful of ammunition, and it had a tendency to become unstable after prolonged bursts on automatic. In the last half of 1944, the German armed forces in the East had lost 800,000 men. In the West, another 780,000 had been lost or were isolated. A vast reservoir of trained and combat-hardened soldiers had simply disappeared. Amongst the German population of military age, high-quality recruits were by now all but impossible to find. And with the Reich threatened from every side, there was little time for proper training. The army tried to make sure that raw recruits were led by experienced NCOs, but the policy was impossible to implement everywhere. The problem was compounded by Hitler's insistence on constantly raising new divisions. Inexperienced and barely trained formations got the best available equipment, while surviving veteran divisions at the front were badly neglected. Their losses in men and weapons rarely made good. In one winter month, when 26,000 machine guns were delivered by German industry, only 1,500 went to frontline formations. The rest went to newly formed units. Only the top divisions of the party army, the Waffen-SS, were favored with anything like adequate replacements of men or equipment. As Adolf Hitler's mistrust of the German army's officer corps had deepened, he had grown more and more convinced that party loyalty, fanatical obedience, and ideological purity were of far greater importance than professional competence. After the bomb plot of July 1944, Hitler had made SS chief Heinrich Himmler commander of the replacement army. Himmler, with virtually no military experience, now controlled all military forces inside Germany and was in charge of the training of all new formations. The ultimate encroachment by the Nazi Party in military affairs came with the raising of the German Home Guard, the Volkssturm. the Volkssturm was to be controlled not by the army, but by the party. Enlistment in the Volkssturm was compulsory for all males between the ages of 16 and 60 not already in military service. Poorly equipped, with little training, and led by men selected for their Nazi credentials, the Volkssturm was expected by Hitler to fight alongside the army. As military units, however, Volkssturm detachments would be largely ineffective, and in the eyes of the regular army, boys and old men thrown heedlessly into battle could only be a tragic and dangerous liability. As 1944 turned to 1945, the German army in the West was still embroiled in Hitler's doomed adventure in the Ardennes. The Führer continued to dismiss all warnings of an imminent Soviet offensive and was even planning another major attack on the Allies. The limit of his interest in the Eastern Front was the plight of the Hungarian capital of Budapest, by now surrounded by the Red Army. Obsessed with Hungary's oil fields, Hitler had first designated Budapest as a Festung, a fortress to be defended to the last man. And then, to the horror of his high command, he had ordered 2 powerful SS divisions to be stripped from the Eastern reserves and sent south to relieve the city. Meanwhile, along the central sector of the front, far from Budapest and its beleaguered garrison, 200 Soviet divisions were poised to thrust at the very heart of Hitler's Germany. In preparing for its great assault on the German heartland, the Red Army faced formidable obstacles. The jumping-off points were 3 bridgeheads the Soviets held on the west bank of the river Vistula, and the railway networks which could supply them had been shattered. Enormous effort had to be expended repairing the lines, and in particular the bridge at Sandomierz, from whence the first Soviet blow would be struck. By the first week in January, the flow of supplies and equipment to the 2 main Russian fronts had turned into a torrent. For the offensive, the Red Army had mustered almost 2.5 million men and 6,500 tanks, half of its entire armored force. The massive Soviet build-up was still far from complete when, from London, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote to Stalin. Churchill begged that the Soviet Union launch an attack as soon as possible to ease German pressure on the Allies in the West. Stalin had scheduled the start of the offensive for the 20th, but he agreed to change the timetable. The attack would begin on January the 12th. The opening blow in the Great Offensive was to be struck by Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front. Konev had massed 500 guns for every mile of his front line, and the success of his attack would depend totally on their effectiveness. The 6,000 aircraft ready for the assault would be unable to play their part in the initial bombardment, The decision to bring forward the date of the attack had virtually guaranteed they would be grounded by bad weather. In the critical sector of the front, facing Konev's forces on the Vistula, the Germans had created a tactical defense zone 10 miles deep. Inside it, on Hitler's direct orders, substantial reserves had been deployed, including 2 Panzer and 2 motorized divisions. What the waiting Germans did not know was that the Soviet artillery plan was designed to annihilate everything inside the zone. At 5 a.m. on the morning of January the 12th, 1945, Konev loosed his opening barrage. Reconnaissance units were pushed forward, hard in the wake of the falling shells. After a brief pause, the guns opened up once more, and this time, the barrage lasted 1 hour and 47 minutes. Its effect on the defenders was shattering. Konev's attack was launched from a bridgehead 40 miles wide near Sandomierz. Standing in the path of his 1st Ukrainian were the German 4th Panzer Army and part of the 17th Army. The assault broke through German lines on a front 25 miles wide, annihilating 4th Panzer. By January the 25th, Konev had reached the River Oder. To the north, 2nd and 3rd Belarusian fronts were poised to strike at the German 3rd Panzer, 4th Army, and part of the 2nd Army, defending East Prussia. The Soviets attacked on January the 13th, but faced with difficult, marshy terrain, they advanced only slowly, not reaching the Baltic until January the 26th. Meanwhile, in the center, Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian front launched its attack on January the 14th. Zhukov smashed through the German defenses with such force that within 3 days he had taken Warsaw. By the 26th, the fortress city of Poznan was cut off, and the German front had virtually disintegrated. By January the 31st, forward elements of 1st Belarusian had penetrated to the middle reaches of the Oder, only 40 miles from Berlin. Four days after the Russian onslaught had begun, Adolf Hitler had moved his headquarters to Berlin, where a bunker had been built beneath the Reichschancellery. From there, he issued a stream of detailed instructions to his field commanders, and failing utterly to comprehend the magnitude of the blow that had fallen on his armies, his intervention served only to make a disastrous situation catastrophic. One of his first acts had been to order the Krak Grossdeutschland Panzer Corps to move 150 miles south from East Prussia, to an area that had already been taken by the Soviets. The Corps was forced to retreat long before it reached its destination. On January the 27th and 28th, German forces in the east were granted a temporary respite when fierce blizzards swept across Eastern and Central Europe. In appalling conditions, the Soviet offensive wavered, and when there was a sudden thaw on the 31st, the Luftwaffe found itself, for the first time since the offensive had begun, with the edge over the enemy. The German aerodromes around Berlin were hard-surfaced, while the grass fields of the Red Air Force were now a quagmire. In 2 days, the Luftwaffe flew 5,000 sorties, smashing supply columns and making movement almost impossible. In spite of relentless German air attacks, the Russians had succeeded in seizing several bridgeheads over the Oder. Marshal Zhukov quickly ordered his forces to replenish their supplies and, in a swift assault, take the German capital on February the 15th. The plan was hopelessly ambitious. After a 300-mile advance, the fuel situation had become critical. Bitter German resistance had cost large numbers of casualties, and just as serious, amongst many Russian formations, discipline had all but collapsed. For vast numbers of Red Army soldiers unleashed on German territory, rape and plunder had become vastly more attractive than fighting. To compound Zhukov's problems, 1st Belorussian's northern flank was now dangerously exposed. The threat to Zhukov's flank was soon dramatically underlined. After a series of increasingly dangerous probing attacks, the German 3rd Panzer Army slammed into Zhukov's line. At first, 3rd Panzer made rapid progress, but on February the 17th, its commander, General Wenck, was seriously injured in a road accident. Without its leader, the German attack lost all momentum and finally petered out. Although unsuccessful, 3rd Panzer's counterattack had an effect out of all proportion to the damage it inflicted. To Marshal Zhukov, it was clear proof that his flank must be secured before the drive to Berlin could be resumed. By now, German resistance all along the Oder line had stiffened immeasurably. The western defences had been virtually stripped to put every possible man and weapon between the Russians and the capital. An enemy thrust to Berlin was expected almost any day. What the Germans did not anticipate was that Zhukov would strike to the north. Russian operations to clear the northern flank began on March the 1st. Within 5 days, Zhukov had pushed deep into Pomerania and had taken Kolberg. By the end of the month, Rokossovsky's 2nd Belorussian had taken Danzig. To the east, 3rd Belorussian destroyed the last German pocket in East Prussia, although the fortress city of Königsberg would remain in German hands for some time. On the southern flank, Marshal Konyev's 1st Ukrainian front had launched its offensive on February the 8th and had quickly reached the river Neisse. Breslau was left encircled, and Konyev's line had been pushed to lie abreast of Zhukov's, posing a dangerous threat to Berlin from the south. Marshal Konyev's offensive had driven the Germans out of the valuable industrial area of Silesia, and most of its mines and factories had been captured intact. Adolf Hitler was now determined that nothing else of value should fall into Russian hands. In the Ukraine and Poland, everything of use to the enemy had been destroyed in the wake of the retreating Germans, leaving behind a trail of devastation. The policy was now to be carried out in the fatherland itself. Hitler insisted that because the best of the German people would have fallen in battle, the only ones left would be those who were inferior, and their needs were irrelevant. Not a bridge, factory, railway, or food store was to be left intact. At the beginning of April, with the Soviet campaigns in Silesia and Pomerania effectively over, the Red Army embarked on its fastest redeployment of the entire war. Every available man, gun, tank and shell was rushed to the Oder-Neisse front for the offensive that would take the Red Army into the heart of Hitler's capital. The logistics were of awesome complexity. On Zhukov's front, the last German stronghold threatening the Soviet bridgehead at Kustrin had been overrun, and 40 engineer battalions had been toiling night and day to build 25 bridges over the Oder, 2 bridges for every mile and a half of front. Zhukov's bridgeheads, of which Kustrin was the biggest, were the most valuable assets the Red Army possessed. Elsewhere, the rivers Neisse and Oder would have to be crossed by boat or by bridges built under enemy fire. But at Kustrin, the door to Berlin had already been prized open. The concentration of forces for the final offensive surpassed anything yet seen in the history of warfare. 2.5 million men, nearly 45,000 guns and rocket launchers, and 6,250 tanks were packed behind a front only 250 miles long. Zhukov alone was massing 7 million tons of artillery ammunition for his initial blow. First Belo-Russian was to launch its drive on a broad front, but striking hardest from its 2 bridgeheads north and south of Frankfurt. Under the direct operational control of Marshal Zhukov, First Belo-Russian had 77 divisions in 11 armies, 6 field armies, a guards army, 2 shock armies, and 2 guards tank armies. Zhukov could also call on the 16th and 18th Air Armies for coordinated air-ground operations. Zhukov's attack would be launched on April the 16th. On Zhukov's right flank, 2nd Belo-Russian front was to attack west and north, securing the main Berlin operation. Commanded by General Konstantin Rokossovsky, 2nd Belo-Russian had 3 field armies, a shock army, and a guards tank army. They would be supported by the 4th Air Army. Rokossovsky would attack on April the 18th. The 1st Ukrainian front was to destroy enemy forces south of Berlin. 1st Ukrainian was commanded by Marshal Ivan Konev, Zhukov's greatest rival. Konev had 3 field armies, 2 guards armies, and 2 tank armies for his initial thrust, with 2 more field armies from 3rd Belo-Russian as reinforcements. However, these would not be in place in time for the start of operations on April the 16th. For support, Konev could call on the 2nd Air Army. On April the 1st, 1945, Marshal Zhukov left his headquarters behind the Oder front and flew to Moscow for consultations with Stalin. Since November of the previous year, Zhukov had understood that Stalin had given him, and him alone, the right to take Berlin. He was about to discover that the rules had changed. Stalin had decided to let Zhukov's 1st Belarusian and Konyev's 1st Ukrainian fronts race each other for the honor of taking the German capital. After his meeting with Stalin, Zhukov and his 1st Belarusian commanders pored over a scale model of the approaches to the city. Zhukov's generals were quickly left in no doubt that anyone who endangered his chances of being first to Berlin would face the direst consequences. On the eve of the Russian onslaught, 1 million German soldiers stood between the Red Army and Berlin. Many divisions were made up of men scoured from police and training units, the Luftwaffe, Volkssturm, Hitler Youth, and foreign SS. But they were still capable of mounting a determined defense. Flying courts-martial and summary executions were the fate of those who showed reluctance to fight. Nor did many expect mercy should the Russian offensive succeed. The greatest problem facing the defenders was a desperate shortage of tanks. Hitler still refused to believe that the main Russian objective was Berlin, and certain that the most powerful attack would be aimed at Czechoslovakia, he sent 4 veteran panzer divisions south. He had already expended the powerful 6th SS Panzer Army in a vain attempt to save the Hungarian oil fields, and only 850 tanks were now left on the Oder front. The full force of the Russian offensive against the German capital would be borne by Army Group Vistula, commanded by Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici, one of the few German experts in defensive warfare. Army Group Vistula fielded 2 armies, 3rd Panzer and 9th Army. 3rd Panzer under General Hasso von Manteuffel had in fact no true panzer formations. Of its 9 divisions, 4 were infantry, including naval and Luftwaffe divisions, and 5 were Panzer Grenadier or Volkssturm divisions, some of them resting. 3rd Panzer occupied a 95-mile front running north of Berlin to the Baltic coast. 9th Army under General Theodor Busse had 1 Panzer, 2 Panzer Grenadier, and 9 infantry divisions. 9th Army defended an 80-mile line on the Oder from Berlin down to the junction with the Neisse. South of 9th Army, the left wing of Army Group Center would also face the Russian onslaught. Commanded by Ferdinand Schörner, now a field marshal, Army Group Center's contribution to the defense would be 4th Panzer Army. 4th Panzer fielded 1 Panzer Division, 9 infantry, and 2 Panzer Grenadier divisions. In reserve around Berlin were the 6 weak divisions of the 56th Panzer Corps, along with 3 infantry divisions of Luftwaffe and headquarters troops, and in Berlin itself, 100 battalions of Volkssturm. There was also the possibility of reinforcement from 12th Army west of Berlin, commanded by General Walter Wenck. 12th Army had 8 infantry divisions made up of raw recruits and remnants. Northwest of Berlin was the formation optimistically named 11th Army, commanded by SS General Felix Steiner. 11th Army had only a police division, a marine division, and later, a division of Panzer Grenadiers. Straddling the Oder, with the Russian bridgehead at Kustrin only a few miles downstream, was the city of Frankfurt, now designated a fortress. On April the 12th, Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, visited General Busse, the commander of 9th Army. Goebbels spoke to Busse's staff, assuring them that fate was on the German side and promising a miracle that would, at a stroke, revive the Reich's fortunes. In an extraordinary twist of fate, that evening Goebbels learned of the death of American President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The news of Roosevelt's passing threw Hitler into a fever of excitement. Not even word that Vienna had fallen to the Soviets could dampen his spirits. The war, Hitler now declared, would be won at the gates of the German capital. There, the Red Army would be drawn into battle and then, encircled from outside, destroyed in an historic German victory. At the very least, the battle would win time, during which the alliance between the Western powers and the Russians would inevitably collapse. On April the 14th, the day after Hitler's ecstatic pronouncement, Russian artillery on the Oder front began to pound German positions around the bridgeheads. Although the sudden Russian onslaught took the Germans completely by surprise, it soon became apparent that this was not the start of the main offensive. It was a reconnaissance in force, mounted by battalion-sized units of infantry and tanks, the prelude to most Soviet offensives. For the German commander of Army Group Vistula, General Heinrici, the question now was exactly when the real blow would fall. If he could guess the Soviet timetable correctly, he might save the bulk of his force on the Oder from instant annihilation. On April the 15th, there was a lull in the fighting around the Oder bridgeheads. At Kustrin, Marshal Zhukov's breakthrough force of 4 infantry and 2 tank armies stood poised for the signal. Behind the front, thousands of aircraft waited, some with targets already identified, others ready to respond to calls from the ground forces. Further south, Konev's 5 infantry and 2 tank armies also waited. With no bridgeheads, they would have to force a crossing of the river Neisse in the teeth of the enemy. The first to strike, in the early hours of April the 16th, would be Marshal Zhukov's first Belarusian front. Zhukov's plan was a novel one. After a massive pre-dawn artillery bombardment by 10,000 guns and 400 Katyusha rocket launchers designed to pulverize the German front line, 140 anti-aircraft searchlights would be turned on to blind the defenders as the infantry rushed their trenches. What Zhukov did not know was that Heinrici had correctly deduced the time of the Russian attack. Opposite Zhukov's bridgehead, the first line of German defences ran parallel to the Russians, along the flat valley floor of the Oder. 5 miles behind was a sandy ridge, 200 feet high, called the Zielau Heights. The ground between the heights and the Oder Valley was intersected by canals, a small river, and numerous streams and drainage ditches. At the foot of the heights were 2 German defense lines, while on the heights themselves, the Germans had prepared their main positions. Mortar pits, anti-tank guns, machine gun emplacements, and dug-in tanks and assault guns completely commanded the plain below. Manning the defences were elements of General Busse's 9th Army. On the night of April the 15th, most units were withdrawn with their heavy weapons to the second line of defence, leaving only a covering force behind. The 9th Luftwaffe Parachute Division, the 20th Panzer Grenadier Division, and the Müncheberg Panzer Division in reserve now held fortified positions, the strength of which Marshal Zhukov had completely failed to comprehend. The awesome barrage that heralded the start of Zhukov's offensive began at 3 a.m. on the morning of April the 16th. In 30 minutes, 500,000 shells rained down on the German front line, rolling onwards to a depth of 5 miles. The effect was stupefying, a concentration of destructive power never before seen in the history of warfare. In fact, Zhukov's plan was already coming badly unstuck. The searchlights, reflected back by clouds of dust and smoke, were blinding the attackers, who were stumbling about amongst the ditches. Even more disturbing, the enemy's frontline trenches were all but deserted. Suddenly, heavy German fire rained down from the Zielau Heights. By dawn, the Russians had still made little progress. Bunched together and obstructed by waterways, they were easy targets for German gunners. The day was well advanced before the Russians reached solid ground below the heights, and there, under a hail of shells, the offensive ground to a halt. The effect of the unexpected setback on Marshal Zhukov was to send him into a towering rage. Even now, he could see the prize that was rightfully his, snatched away by Marshal Konev. On Konev's Nysa front, the opening barrage had begun at 4:15 a.m. along a 250-mile line. At the same time, massed bombers of the Second Air Army pulverized German rear areas and communications. One 18-mile sector in particular was saturated with high explosives. It was there that Konev planned to launch his main thrust, and he had chosen it for only one reason. A breakthrough in that area would allow a dash for Berlin at the soonest possible moment. Under cover of smoke, the first of Konev's battalions began crossing at 5:55 a.m. Russian artillery and machine guns, firing on a flat trajectory, blazed all the while, forcing the Germans to stay under cover while bridging equipment was brought up. An hour after the first troops crossed, Konev's tanks and self-propelled guns were in action on the west side of the Neisse and racing for the River Spree. By 10 a.m. on the morning of Zhukov's attack at Zilau, Soviet bombers had smashed most of the German heavy guns on top of the ridge. The Russian artillery had been redeployed forward, and now it too added its weight to the storm unleashed on German positions. By now, elements of Zhukov's First Guards Army had overrun the German trenches at the foot of the Zilau Heights. However, the last line was proving impossible to storm. Zhukov decided to send in his 2 tank armies. The terrain was totally unsuitable, and within hours, 1,300 tanks and self-propelled guns were locked in one vast traffic jam under the fire of German artillery. It would take 3 days, and in all, 30,000 Russian dead, before Zhukov would finally take the heights and begin his frantic dash for the German capital. While Zhukov was stalled at the Zilau Heights, Konev's first Ukrainian front had reached the upper stretches of the Spree, the river that flowed through the heart of Berlin. Finding it fordable, lead tanks dashed across. The German line was quickly shattered, and on reporting to Stalin, Konev was told exactly what he wanted to hear. He could turn his 2 tank armies towards Berlin. That same day, April the 18th, 50 miles north of Berlin, Marshal Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front launched its assault on the lower reaches of the River Oder. Second Belarusian would be met by more than 30 German counterattacks. It would take 2 days for Rokossovsky's forces to break out of their bridgeheads, and casualties would be heavy. However, the offensive was fulfilling its main function. It was keeping the German 3rd Panzer Army away from the defense of Berlin. On the morning of April the 20th, Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday, with Russian forces only 20 miles from Berlin, American bombers launched the final 1,000-bomber raid of the war. The effect, on a city already reduced to rubble, was to sever the last of its water and gas supplies. For Berlin's civilian population, tens of thousands of whom were living in cellars, scavenging what food they could, it was one more sign that the end was near. Shortly after the last American bombers headed for home, Adolf Hitler emerged from his bunker into the Chancellery Garden for his traditional birthday celebration. Instead of the customary parade of 40,000 soldiers, the Führer, his eyes glassy and his hands trembling, was greeted by a handful of Hitler Youth and SS. After this bizarre valediction, the Führer would never be seen in public again. By April the 21st, Marshal Zhukov's 2nd Guards Tank Army had reached the northeastern suburbs of Berlin. Meanwhile, tanks of the 47th Army raced to outflank the city from the north, while along the center, 6 armies pressed forward. The German 9th Army was now hopelessly cut off from the rest of Army Group Vistula. To the south of the city, Konev's tank armies, dashing for Zossen and Potsdam, had driven straight through 4th Panzer. 4th Panzer's left wing was now being pushed into a pocket with the 9th. The bulk of the German forces supposed to defend Berlin were left surrounded and helpless. Forward elements of Zhukov's first Belarusian front had already begun to shell the center of Berlin. For Russian artillerymen, it was an unmistakable sign that victory was near. The message was not lost on senior Nazi officials. They fled the city in droves, taking with them as many valuables as they could. 2 million ordinary citizens had no such hope. For men, even the very young and the very old, the penalty for trying to leave was death. The day after Marshal Konev's spearheads penetrated the Berlin suburbs, his prize already in range of his guns, Stalin, at a stroke, dashed his hopes of being hailed as the conqueror of the Nazi enemy. Zhukov was to take the Reichstag, the outstanding symbol of German might. Konev's line would be allowed no closer than 150 yards. Throughout the ranks of his first Ukrainian front, there was bitter disappointment. The men would still have to fight and die, but the laurels would go elsewhere. On April the 24th, units of 1st Belarusian and 1st Ukrainian fronts met southwest of Berlin. The capital was surrounded. The same day, American and Russian troops met on the River Elbe. Germany had been cut in two. As the Russians had swung around Berlin to complete its encirclement, the pocket, which held the German 9th Army and part of the 4th Panzer Army, had been squeezed inexorably. Inside were 200,000 men, 300 tanks, 2,000 guns, and tens of thousands of trapped refugees. Only the German 12th Army to the west, commanded by General Wenck, seemed to offer any hope. Hitler ordered Wenck to link up with 9th Army and relieve the capital. On April the 26th, Wenck attacked, penetrating to within 15 miles of Berlin before stalling. 2 German corps would eventually succeed in breaking out of the 9th Army pocket and joining up with the 12th, but the rest would perish to a man. By April the 25th, Zhukov and Konev had regrouped their forward units in Berlin for siege warfare. With the experience of Stalingrad behind them, the Russians knew exactly how to set about the task of reducing a city. Assault groups were formed from a company of infantry. supported by 6 or more anti-tank guns, a troop of tanks or assault guns, 2 engineer platoons, and a flamethrower platoon. To tighten the noose around the city, the assault groups went into action around the clock, blasting their way from building to building, clearing each room by room. There was no pause in the fighting while the Russian commanders prepared for the last act in the battle for Berlin. Between them, they were ringing the inner city with almost 500,000 men, 12,700 guns, 21,000 rocket launchers, and 1,500 tanks. So far, the Soviet front line had penetrated the capital's outer defensive ring in only 2 main areas, to the east and to the north. The defenders on the perimeter were mostly remnants of units pulled back after Zielau. The 18th, 20th and 25th Panzer Grenadier Divisions, the Müncheberg Division, 9th Paratroop Division, and SS Divisions Nordland and Charlemagne. With Volkssturm and other assorted formations, the total garrison of armed defenders was now almost 300,000. However, barely 50,000 were veteran combat soldiers. The ferocious barrage unleashed on the German defensive perimeter, although it killed thousands of defenders and civilians, served only to make the central districts even more formidable obstacles than they had been before. Fanatical SS units, backed by artillery and dug-in tanks, contested every strong point, often to the last man. Thousands of Hitler Youth, armed with Panzerfausts, made the streets death traps for Soviet tanks. Around the Tempelhof aerodrome, on the south side of the city, fighting was particularly ferocious. The Russians were haunted by the fear that Hitler, whose whereabouts were still unknown, would use one of several aircraft kept in an underground bunker to escape from their clutches. After a determined assault, by noon on April the 26th, the runways and buildings were in Soviet hands, and the aerodrome's commandant had been captured. As the Red Army pressed ever closer to the heart of Berlin, seemingly careless of the cost, desperate German defenders resorted to creating obstacles by destroying everything in the path of the Russians. With so many streets blocked with rubble, the Soviets were forced to blast their way forward by dynamiting holes in the walls of houses, or tunneling beneath the city from one cellar to another. Only then could they pass from street to street. One by one, often after brutal hand-to-hand fighting, German bunkers, pillboxes and strongpoints were eliminated. Some Germans surrendered, elderly Volkssturm and reservists most readily, but others, particularly units of SS Nordland and Charlemagne, clung on grimly to every mound of rubble. Dutch, Danish, Flemings, Norwegians and French these men had joined the SS to crusade against the Bolsheviks. Now, with their native lands liberated and the Reich crashing down around their heads, there was no option but to fight and die. By April the 27th, the Germans had been pressed into a corridor running from east to west, 10 miles long and 3 miles wide. By the following day, the pocket had shrunk even further. The government sector around the Reichstag and the Reichschancellery, with its bunker beneath, was now the full extent of Adolf Hitler's dominion. Even as Russian shells pounded his Reichschancellery, Hitler, in his bunker 55 feet below, continued to believe that at any moment, General Wenck's 12th Army would save the day. Although hundreds, possibly thousands of people were dying every hour, there was no thought of surrender. General Karl Wiedling, battle commandant of Berlin, reported to Hitler that there was now only 2 days' supply of ammunition left, and the wounded were dying for lack of food and medicine. Wiedling's suggestion that the remnants of his forces, spearheaded by the remaining tanks and assault guns, should break out to the west, was angrily dismissed by Hitler. By the night of the 29th, the fighting was less than a quarter of a mile from Adolf Hitler's bunker. There, the Führer dictated his last will and testament. Field Marshal Schörner, struggling far to the south with the remnants of his Army Group Center, was made the last commander-in-chief of the German army. Hitler himself had already decided to commit suicide in the ruins of his capital. He was determined that the Russians should never take him alive. While Konev's forces blasted their way into the central district through the heavily defended Tiergarten Zoo, Zhukov's men had fought their way to within sight of the Reichstag. The building was manned by several thousand SS men, but the soldiers of 3rd Shock Army had already been told that whoever raised the red banner on its roof would be made a hero of the Soviet Union. The banners had been distributed to all its divisions before the battle, and now 150th Division stood on the threshold. Against the most fanatical opposition, with every apartment and stairway contested, it took almost 10 hours to clear the upper stories of the building. But at 22:50 hours on April the 30th, 1945, Men of the 1st Battalion of the 756th Rifle Regiment planted the red flag on the roof of the Reichstag. Adolf Hitler had already killed himself in his chancellery bunker. The death of Hitler was not the end of the Battle of Berlin. From Hitler's bunker, Joseph Goebbels and General Krebs, the German Chief of Staff, won a brief local truce to discuss the terms of surrender and deluded themselves that they had a right to be treated as a government. Meanwhile, bitter fighting continued to rage as pockets of defenders fought to the end, or battle groups tried to break out through Russian lines. On the afternoon of May the 1st, Russian patience ran out. At 6:30 p.m., every gun, mortar, and rocket launcher in Berlin opened fire on the Chancellery and the last pockets of German resistance. The following morning, at 6 a.m., General Wiedling, commander of the Berlin defenders, surrendered to the Russians. He was allowed to dictate a signal to be sent to all German forces in the city, ordering them to lay down their arms. At 3 p.m. on May the 2nd, the Russian guns fell silent. The Battle of Berlin took a staggering toll in human life. Hitler's refusal to surrender before the final cataclysm cost the Red Army 305,000 casualties, the worst losses it had suffered in any battle of the war. The number of German military dead is unknown, but of the civilian population of Berlin, 125,000 perished. Many more had been wounded, raped, or driven insane by the hell around them. On May the 8th, 1945, Germany formally surrendered to the Allies. Accepting on behalf of the Soviet Union was Marshal Zhukov, victor of the Battle of Berlin. With his conquest of the German capital, Zhukov was delivering to Stalin not just a final and historic victory over Nazi Germany, but the key to a future Soviet empire in Central and Eastern Europe. The war was over. Hitler was dead, and the Third Reich had been utterly destroyed. However, in the Battle of Berlin, the seeds of a new conflict had already been sown. A conflict between East and West that would divide Europe and the world for 2 generations.